Well, the word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took a book collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came. And the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things I haven't done. Just you wait, just you wait.
Everyone, to this evening's presentation. We're calling it our Independence Day Weekend Mobilization Town Hall. And our program tonight is entitled Alexander Hamilton, the American System and Today's Campaign for National Banking. But in plain English, what we will be discussing is the long history and the bright future of public banking for our country. My name is Julie Olson. I'll be your moderator this evening. My interest in the National Infrastructure Bank stems from my long career in business, where I've had a front row seat viewing the decline in manufacturing, critical manufacturing in our country, and the outsourcing and the moving overseas of critical manufacturing capacity, and the lack of investment in bricks and mortar here in the US. It's my belief that a national infrastructure bank will help get our economy back on track, delivering real projects with real benefits like good paying jobs, water for irrigation and for drinking, and affordable housing, energy, and transportation for all regions of our country. So I'd like to just take a moment to share with you a description of what public banking actually is, and this is from the Democracy Policy Network. Public banks are lending and depository institutions owned and managed by a government entity that acts in the public interest. They leverage public and maybe private funds to create credit that serves the public in a variety of ways, from infrastructure projects to, in some cases, small business loans. Most large private banks, which serve private shareholders and often seek short-term profits in order to maximize payoffs to those shareholders, and let's not forget exorbitant CEO compensation. But public banks keep capital local by investing in community enterprises and public projects in pursuit of the long-term economic health of the communities they serve. In doing so, public banks help democratize the economy. By increasing the availability of productive capital in a community, it gives more people and projects access to more funding. It empowers citizens and communities to engage with the economy on their own terms and to transform their local economies for the better. So with that, we're going to go right to our speakers. We have an illustrious group tonight that's going to be sharing some thoughts with us on public banking in our country. And what we're going to do is just move right on through the speakers so we can make sure that everyone has the opportunity to share with us their information. And I do want to share with you some breaking news, and that is that this morning, the lower house in California passed the joint resolution, as you see here, joint resolution number 32 on creating a national infrastructure bank. So that is very exciting to see that momentum happening in one of the largest economies in the world, actually, the state of California. And that will be going to the Senate then, and we hope to get that approved in the Senate in August in California. So thanks to all the California folks that helped make that happen. Okay, so now let's move on to our list of speakers. So first on our list, we have Alfeka Mutardi. She has spent 25 years working for the International Monetary Fund as a senior economist there. And with that, we'll go right to Alfeka.
I just wanted to give you an update on things. Many of you have heard me say this before, but for those people who are new to the National Infrastructure Bank concept, I wanted to let you know that we have a bill in Congress to create a National Infrastructure Bank. We currently have 12 co-sponsors on this bill in the House, and we're actively looking for both Republicans and Democrats, and that's the purpose of today's meeting, is to give you ways that you as local grassroots organizers can go out on 4th of July picnics where your members of Congress might be there, and buttonhole them, take along your flyer on how the National Infrastructure Bank works, and tell them that you really want them to co-sign onto this bill. That's our grassroots strategy that's really working. We've doubled up our number of co-sponsors recently by using this grassroots support effort to get our members of Congress to sign on board. So, of course, we've had 4 national banks in our nation's past. The very first one was started by Alexander Hamilton. This is very much a Hamiltonian concept. These 4 banks were very successful, built most of our nation's infrastructure. They're not around anymore because they had a 20-year sunset clause in them, and that's why we need a 5th bank. And this bill in Congress will create that 5th bank, but it's modeled on the earlier 4. The way that it works, and this is the Hamiltonian, again, the Hamiltonian model, is we go to the private sector who are holding treasuries and ask them if they would like to sell in their treasuries to capitalize the bank. And that makes them silent partners in the bank and gets it fully capitalized, which is a requirement of banks like this. Once the capital is in there, then the bank can give out a loan, and the loan process works exactly like a commercial bank, uses the same accounting software and so forth, and then actually creates money as it gives out loans. All commercial banks work like this and create 90% of our money supply. Our bank, of course, is sized to cover all of our infrastructure need for new money, which we estimate is at the $5 trillion range. And that is based on estimates of the American Society of Civil Engineers. We want to repair all of our transportation systems, roads, bridges, mass transit. We want to get all of our water infrastructure systems fixed, get all of the lead service lines out, repair leaking water pipes, and get our stormwater systems back on track. We want to make sure our electric power grid is up to what we need it for, which is not to break down because of weather events and bringing on electric cars. And we want to get a complete high-speed rail network in our country, where other countries have done this, use banks like this, and we want our National Infrastructure Bank to be able to finance all that. Broadband everywhere. We want to build affordable housing units. This is really a big crisis in America right now. So is drought in the Southwest, where we grow our nation's food supply. If we don't take care of it, we're going to have higher food prices at the grocery store. And what Congress passed recently, the bipartisan infrastructure law, is just simply too small. It's only 1/10 of what we need. Our economy is really slipping, and I did want to give you an update on this. Inflation is rampant, as we all know. When we've gone to the gas station or the grocery store, it's running at 8.6%. Now that's a 40-year high. Interest rates are way up, including 30-year mortgages. Now, the latest news 2 days ago is that not only did the economy contract in the first quarter at an annualized rate of 1.6%, but the Bureau of Economic Analysis has said that it seems that it's contracting in the second quarter as well. That technically puts us into a recession when you have 2 back-to-back quarters like that where the economy has gone down. Add to that the fact that the Fed is really clamping down on the money supply to fight inflation, and that's going to make the recession worse. So the solution is to have a national infrastructure bank. It'll build all of our nation's infrastructure. It'll lean against the wind of the economy going backwards. It'll raise real wages for workers. It'll help supply chain problems to get resolved. It'll raise economic growth, no new inflation because we'll grow faster, we'll produce more, and all without any new taxes, debt, or deficit spending. Tell your members of Congress we can pay for everything, and we won't have to raise taxes or on the federal budget or deficits to do it. And this is such a great deal for so many reasons that I've just mentioned. So for that, I'll turn it over to the other speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Alfetta, for that very good summary of the National Infrastructure Bank. Next, we're going to go to the esteemed Edward Cornell, Professor of Law and Finance at Cornell University and expert on the Hamiltonian tradition. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Robert Hockett.
Great, thanks so much, Julie. And it's great to be on again with Alfetta and Ellen in particular. We're kind of long-term comrades in this struggle. So maybe what I'll do is sort of complement some of the things that Alfeka just said. I'll do it in a couple of ways. First, I'm going to identify two sort of intellectual errors that seem to have sort of vitiated most of our thought in the realm of national development, national production, and in basically even just macroeconomic policy more generally. Then I'll sort of identify a kind of a formula, an institutional formula that seems to have worked very well for us in the past and can do so again. And then I'll link that up specifically with the NIB that Alfeka just mentioned, in addition to one other institutional reform that I've proposed that's kind of complementary to that Alfeka has just told you about. So the two intellectual errors are kind of mutually interlocking. The first is that contemporary or modern economics seems to have lost any conception whatever of production. It's almost as though all economics were about was sort of how to distribute or how to allocate what we've already got, but people seem to be somehow tongue-tied or even to experience a kind of institutional aphasia when it comes to questions of production, right? We don't talk about how stuff gets made, where it gets made, how we arrange or organize production, what sort of works when it comes to organizing production, what sort of doesn't. We don't seem to talk about that. And that's one reason then why, when there is an inflation like the current one, all people seem to be able to talk about is monetary policy. It's kind of as if, it's like the old adage, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if all you've got in your mind is sort of how to distribute stuff that already exists, and suddenly it looks like there's too much money chasing too few goods, you don't even think about doing something about the too few goods side of that equation. And instead you just say, well, let's just trim back the money as well. In other words, let's attack demand rather than addressing the supply problem, as for example, Larry Summers is pushing now, and even just come right out and say the quiet part out loud, as Larry Summers has been doing of late, saying we need to raise the unemployment rate in order to trim back on that demand. But again, it just doesn't seem to occur to these people that you might actually work on the supply side of that demand supply equation. The second intellectual error is, again, I think closely linked up with the first one. And I think this one probably dates back to the Cold War period. It has to do with the idea, it's basically the idea that of viewing development or national development as a sort of one-off achievement, you know, something that you begin undeveloped, then you develop, and then you're done. That's all there is to it. Rather than viewing development as something that is kind of basically forever. Development goes on for as long as society exists, and as long as the society wishes to progress over time with technological developments and the like. I think that might date back to the Cold War, because it seems that the big sort of bulge in development economic thought came as a sort of response to the perception that we had to compete with the Soviet Union for client states. And so let's try to get that developing world, all these newly freed former colonial countries, let's help them get developed, quote unquote, in the way that we were, say, circa 1950 or 1960, so that they won't be as tempted by the blandishments of the communists. And so we basically started thinking then of development sort of in the terms introduced by Walt Rostow, who was an economist, but who interestingly was employed by the State Department rather than by any economic department or by the Treasury Department, say. And he developed this idea of a takeoff, right? So you want to help a country reach takeoff, and then it takes off and it becomes industrialized, and now it's developed. That, again, I think encourages the sort of tendency not to pay attention to production, because production and development kind of go together, right? And indeed, one way of thinking of development is as essentially the sort of evolution over time of productive capacity and the improvement over time of productive capacity, in addition to the menu of things that can be produced. So in essence, then, what we're sort of stuck with at the moment is this all I have is a hammer problem. But in this case, it's again, an intellectual problem. It's all I have in my mind is a hammer, even though we've got all these tools laid out across the table before us, as Alfeka herself was just noting. Now, if I were to sort of characterize the tools in turn, or sort of come up with a way of sort of a short form way of characterizing the kinds of tools that we have, One way to do it would be to identify this formula, sort of an institutional formula that I noted at the outset that I would get to. So now I'll turn to that really quickly. We seem over time in the US, when the sort of question or challenge of development or improving productive capacity has come up, to have lit on a kind of a two-tiered or two-part strategy. On the one hand, we think in terms of coordination. We recognize that a national development problem or a national productive capacity enhancement or modernization problem is itself a complex problem. It involves lots of different industries. It involves lots of different geographical regions because we are a continental or a continent spanning country. It also involves multiple levels of government, right? Federal, state, local, regional. And then, of course, it also involves both the public and the private sector. And so you need some means of coordinating, planning, and acting across industrial sectors, across public and private divides, and of course, across regions of the country and across levels of government. Now, how have we done this in the past? Well, basically, we've simply formed, in effect, coordinating bodies, right? The best known or the most recent dramatic example, I would suggest, was essentially the War Planning Board that the Roosevelt administration put into place when it became clear that we were going to have to jumpstart military production really quickly after the Germans, to everybody's surprise, overran France, which had the largest army in Europe, in a mere 6 weeks, right? Rather than getting bogged down in trenches again, as it happened in the First World War. So Roosevelt understood, oh my God, we're going to have to really jumpstart our production. We're going to have to produce 50,000 warplanes a year. This was at a time when American aircraft industry produced barely 3,000 per year, and people laughed at him or thought he was smoking something. But in fact, we did end up producing scores of thousands, not just of military planes, but tanks, ships, uniforms. We even jump-started entire new industries like synthetic rubber and the like. And all of this was sort of planned out or coordinated by this board structure, which combined public sector actors and private sector actors together. And both public and private sort of focused on what they did best. Now, here's the key. That particular function was sort of foreshadowed before Roosevelt's War Production Board by President Wilson's War Industries Board, and a kind of counterpart to that even well beforehand in Hamilton's day, which you can think of as a sort of complement to Hamilton's bank, was a Society for the Promotion of Useful Manufactures that was essentially founded over in Paterson, New Jersey. And the whole idea here was to sort of map out a strategy to make the United States, the new United States, self-sufficient where essentially industrial capacity and the development of a diversified and mixed economy was concerned, so that we wouldn't remain a de facto colony of Britain after having finally ceased being a political colony of Great Britain, which we would have been or would have done had it not been for people like Hamilton, because what we did best, the sort of comparative advantage, to use the sort of Ricardian lingo of the US at that time, was simply to send them wood and beaver pelts, right? That's what we do best because we don't have any industry. And of course, the problem with the Ricardian view of this is it treats as fate something which is actually an object of choice. And Hamilton understood this and said, look, yeah, you can accept a current distribution of comparative advantage, that is to say, a current distribution of capacities, but you can also alter that distribution of capacities by developing your own capacity, which you're going to have to do if you don't want to revert to colonial status. So that's one sort of piece of the sort of institutional secret, or the secret recipe, we might say. The other piece, which in fact I just told you about, is the financing part of it. In other words, it's all well and good to have a coordinating body or a planning board of some kind that combines interests and industries and levels of government and so forth, but you also have to have some means of executing on what you've planned out or what you've visualized, what you've envisaged, right? And that's where Hamilton's bank came into place. And it's also where a little entity called the War Finance Corporation came into the story during the Wilson period, which was then followed up by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, which was patterned explicitly after the WFC, when the Great Depression began getting quite serious. And so the RFC then played a critical role in addition in the Second World War mobilization. So what we need at present, I think, is counterparts to both of those, both of those sets of predecessors. We need, in other words, institutions to fulfill both of those specific functions, right? And the idea of a national infrastructure bank is, I think, the best way to deal with the financing piece of the story. And then I think in order to sort of handle that kind of coordinating body piece of the story, what we need to do is construct something that I think of or call a National Reconstruction and Development Council. And I've got legislation that's now being considered in Congress, sort of alongside the legislation that Alfeka told you about, that there's probably going to be a big announcement on right after the July 4th recess from Congress. So we'll probably be hearing more about this. But one way to think about this council is it basically takes all cabinet members that are part of the White House cabinet who have jurisdiction over significant portions of the nation's industrial base or its infrastructures, and in addition brings onto the board, in at least an ex officio capacity, various private sector experts in the sort of industries of tomorrow, the industries of the future, the industries of the new green economy that we're all pushing toward, all together to develop plans along these lines. You can also analogize it in a way then to the FSOC, right? The Financial Stability Oversight Council, which combines previously siloed financial regulators, or you can compare it to the National Security Council, the NSC, which brings together all of the distinct national security and defense agencies that are part of our federal government. The problem with siloing, I think we all know pretty well now, and it's fairly easy to sort of reorganize a little bit so that they're no longer siloing, but instead are planning or mapping out what we can think of as a national development strategy or a national reconstruction and development strategy. So a council of this sort operating in tandem then with a national infrastructure bank, essentially a financial arm that can then find the financing for and lever up any appropriations that are made to it, is again sort of the secret formula, it seems to me. And that's why I think the present time is a particularly exciting time for all of us, because we finally begin to see people beginning to realize the importance of going about things in this particular way, recognizing the sense in which our inflation problem is a supply side problem more than a demand side problem at this point, and recognizing that supply doesn't simply take care of itself, and that coordinating a nationwide industrial revival requires some coherent and thoughtful planning. So I think I'll just leave it with a quote from my favorite development economist, who most people probably don't think of as a development economist, but somebody who I think ought to be listened to a lot more carefully than Larry Summers appears to be being listened to. And that's the development economist Bob Dylan, who famously uttered this wonderful sentence or sort of oracular pronouncement in the middle of a wonderful song, where he said, "He not busy being born is busy dying." The United States at this particular juncture is busy dying, and it has been busy dying for decades now. But we don't have to die. We don't have to roll over and play dead. The first step to not doing that is to stop listening to Larry Summers. The second step is to put in place a council and a bank of the kind that we're talking about here this evening. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you for that great presentation. That certainly gave us all some good things to think about. And we are now going to go out to Los Angeles, California, where we have Ellen Brown, who is the chair of the Public Banking Institute. Ellen, take it away.
Thanks. That was great, Bob. I'm afraid I can't rattle off the top of my head like Bob does. So I have a PowerPoint, which has, once again, way too many words for the amount of time I have, but I'll share it anyway if I can share a screen. And I'll just not do it all, I guess, so I can get that up. So slideshow from beginning. So the American system of government issued money and credit was key both to winning the Revolutionary War, which is what, of course, July 4th is all about, and to transforming the nation from a collection of agrarian economies, which were basically colonized by the British, to an industrial powerhouse. To start with, the colonies issued their own paper script. So they didn't really have gold and silver, and still they managed to have a flourishing economy with this paper script. That worked great until King George said they couldn't do it. And then there was a depression and unemployment, and that triggered the American Revolution, according to Benjamin Franklin. So the colonists won the war again by just issuing paper money, the famous or infamous Continentals. Franklin wrote that the whole is a mystery, even to the politicians, how we could pay with paper that had no previous fixed fund appropriated specifically to redeem it. This currency, as we manage it, is a wonderful machine. And Thomas Paine also called it a cornerstone of the revolution. The problem with the paper continental, as also is infamously known, is that it went to zero by the end of the war, not really because the Continental Congress was issuing too much, but because the British were counterfeiting it. It was easy to counterfeit, it was just paper. So Alexander Hamilton rescued the situation. The states were left with a $44 million debt, which was huge at that time. So Hamilton controversially solved the problem with debt for equity swaps. So he swapped that debt for partial payment for stock in the first US bank. And that's of course the same model that's being followed by the current National Infrastructure Bank bill. And that capital was leveraged into credit, which was issued as the first US currency. This was the fractional reserve model. Hamilton said it is a well-established fact that banks in good credit can circulate a far greater sum than the actual quantum of their capital in gold and silver. The problem was that this was the Bank of England's model. And so Hamilton got a bad reputation as fostering, or today, every time I bring up Hamilton, I get all this pushback from people that say, oh no, he was responsible for the predatory Wall Street system that triggered the Great Depression, the Great Recession, et cetera. But in fact, there were fundamental differences between the Bank of the United States and the Bank of England models. Most significantly was their purpose. One was purposed for public development, the other for private gain. So Hamilton intended that his bank would be used to establish a sovereign currency, which it did, establish a banking system, and be a source of credit to build the nation, creating productive wealth, not just financial profit. He said a bank's function was to generate active capital for agricultural manufacturers, increasing the quantity and quality of labor and industry. Unlike the Bank of England, the bank would issue credit to the government and private interests for internal improvements, according to Hamilton's system of public credit. It was only later that Wall Street used this credit for speculative rather than constructive purposes, gouging the public with usurious interest rates, all those things that we blame them for now. But that predatory model was what certain early American economists called the British system. The point was to exploit the colonies through free trade, and basically to exploit the government by making the government fund the bank. And they were charged usurious interest rates by this private group that founded the Bank of England. And it was chartered to be an instrument of government policy. It capitalized exclusively by public debt. So by contrast, and they could control the policies that the government could fund. By contrast, Hamilton's bank was to be a commercial bank. So it would essentially be self-supporting, generating credit for infrastructure and development. But it was heavily opposed by Madison and Jefferson, leading to the two-party system. Madison and Jefferson said that the Constitution didn't grant the government the power to charter a bank or to charter a corporation at all. And Hamilton said the power was implied under the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. He said a bank was necessary to create the more perfect union called for by the preamble to the Constitution. And of course, Washington sided with Hamilton and we got the bank. But the bank was only chartered for 20 years. And when the 20 years was up, it was allowed to expire. And then we had a period of economic hardships, which prompted Congress to charter another bank, the second Bank of the United States, founded in 1816 under John Quincy Adams, basically on the same model. And it was even more controversial. It was prompted Andrew Jackson's war on the bank and on the longest standing president, which was Nicholas Biddle. Jackson thought that money should be gold and silver, and that was it. Only sound money was gold and silver, but we didn't have that much gold and silver, and you couldn't fund infrastructure just on the money you had. If you're funding something in the future, you need credit, which is something that you create out of what you have. So that's what the bank would do, create credit. But like Hamilton and the first US bank, Biddle and the second US bank were unjustly maligned. The bank funded one of the most intense periods of economic progress in history. It invested directly in canals, railroads, roads, coal and iron enterprises, and it lent money to states and cities to do such projects. It also managed credit so that investments within the United States and from overseas constantly flowed in where they were needed productively. And Biddle managed the bank intervention in markets to stabilize prices, et cetera. So it worked very well, solved many problems. And after Jackson shut the second US bank down, we went through another period of economic crisis, and Lincoln was left with he was faced with a civil war as soon as he got into office. And so he founded it by reviving the American system, and basically the system of the American colonists would just issue the money directly with the greenbacks. And he set up a system of national banks, which the banks were required to capitalize their banknotes with government debt. So those two sources of money funded the war effort and rapid economic development, including the Transcontinental Railroad. And that actually turned a nice profit for the government. Not only did it cost nothing, but it turned a profit. Meanwhile, the American system and its leaders inspired an international movement. Other British colonies revolted, including Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and other countries rebelled against the British imperial free trade doctrines and developed their own infrastructure and manufacturing, including Germany, Ireland, Russia, Japan, India, Mexico, and South America. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia, I was just reading about that recently, it's pretty interesting. It was masterminded by an American named King O'Malley, who called Hamilton the greatest financial man who ever walked the earth. It was definitely built on the Hamiltonian system. And through the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, the country was able to fund major national development, along with Australia's participation in World War I, just by issuing the credit of the bank. In fact, the private banks said, well, you're going to need to borrow something from us to capitalize your bank. And the president of the bank said, no, I think we'll just base it on the credit of the nation. And it worked. In the US, meanwhile, we got the Federal Reserve and the worst banking crisis and economic depression ever in 1929 to 33. Of course, that was international. But so Roosevelt used the same model, the Hamiltonian model, to rebuild the economy with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, funded with $500 million of capitalization initially. It issued bonds, and over the course of 25 years, it loaned or invested over $40 billion and funded the New Deal and World War II, and turned a profit at the end of all that. So quite a remarkable model. And in Canada, from 1939 to 74, the Bank of Canada did the same, issued its own money, the same as the Commonwealth Bank of Australia had done, issued money that it lent to the government, of course. And so these are loans. The money would go out, it would build something productive, and what it produced would pay back the loans. And again, they funded their participation in World War II, education benefits, family allowances, old age pensions, Trans-Canada Highway, and et cetera, and universal health care, their great universal health care system. And what happened in 1974 is pretty interesting, but obviously I don't have time to go into it. So the stellar model today is China, which went from one of the poorest countries in the world to global economic powerhouse in 4 decades. So how did they do it? They built 12,000 miles of high-speed rail in a decade, along with the world's largest dam and power station. How did they do it? The government owns 80% of Chinese banking assets, including 3 massive development banks. So again, the government just borrows from their bank, which creates credit. The credit goes out, builds the thing, and then the fees from whatever they built pay off the loan. And we could and should use that same model, which originated from the Hamiltonian model in the American Revolution, with our national infrastructure bank, and could achieve the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that excellent presentation on the history of public banking in the US, and certainly the updates on some other countries around the world. I think that should help reinforce for everybody that public banking is not a new idea, and it certainly shouldn't be a controversial idea, because it has helped the US in our past and is helping other countries currently around the planet to make those needed investments. So what we're going to do now with our next speaker is kind of pivot a little bit and talk about our mobilization efforts and what we are doing around the country to move forward the idea of creating a national infrastructure bank in the US. So with that, I'd like to go to our next speaker, Assemblyman Felix Ortiz, former Assistant Speaker of the New York Assembly. Felix?
Thank you very much. In another part of the country. So it is my my honor to be with all of you. Let me just point out for those who are the first time hearing my name, I was the first legislator 3 years ago that introduced the first landmark national infrastructure banking resolution in the New York State Assembly. As a result of that resolution being introduced, I thank Stuart for giving me the opportunity to really learn so much about the opportunity that he was offering to me, because a month before that I was visiting China, and I was telling Ellen was talking about China for a little while, but well, when I went into China in probably 1996, my first time, but when I went back, when Stuart came with the National Infrastructure Banking 3 years ago, a month and a half before that, the difference between 96 and 2000 probably 9 was that China already had managed to develop so much infrastructure regarding railroad in order to connect Providence to Providence, because they believe that the only way to mobilize the economy is to really connect communities and communicate and connect their Providence, where people can go from, for example, from Canton to Shanghai, from Nanjing to Beijing, and they can go back home. The sense of going back home at night, that was very motivated for the workers who choose to do the railroad as a transport or communicate or commute to work. And this is something that attracted me when Stuart brought this to my attention. The second component of all this resolution, and this is something that we also have to continue to re-emphasize to our Congress people, especially during this weekend where, you know, for example, in the state of New York, I know I'm going to be seeing some of these candidates and great Congress people that sometimes they show up only when they July 4th, we had the marching of our community running around the neighborhood. So we will need to make sure that we reach out to them and talk to them and tell them why this is important. Number one, competition with China, infrastructure, broadband, housing, affordable housing. Number three, the important that this is a resolution that our individual at the local level wouldn't be able to pay taxes. You know, they will alleviate all of us to ensure that that it's not going to be no more property taxes, school taxes, add to the national infrastructure as a result of the national infrastructure banking. For those of you who probably, and the last thing I would like to say also is that when I went to Philippines and I went to Tanzania, the Chinese folks, they was building railroad in Tanzania, and they was helping to rebuild infrastructure in the Philippines. So this is telling you a quick example how China really began to expand so enormous around the global economy. And the other thing is, I do believe, someone can correct me, but I believe I heard President Biden say that on the G7, that he would like to have all the G7 to be connected to ensure that we can develop an infrastructure banking globally in order to push China back. Well, Mr. President, we don't need to wait for G7. We can do it in the United States, and we can do it now if Congress is up to it. Because bottom line here is that we do have the opportunity in our hands to tell G7 or G8 in the next year, whatever, to tell them to say, listen, we did the national infrastructure banking in the United States. It's working, it's performing well. Now we're going to push this globally, and that will push China to really to shake a little bit. So the other thing I'm going to say is that we do have a lot of I mentioned this last time, that every day that passed by in Washington DC, when in our country, which is something new coming up, and everything else take a second place, a third place, and a fourth place. So now you have the Supreme Court with the decision that they have made, and more decision coming up, and Washington continue to be completely dysfunctional and irrational, especially now with all the election that is coming and the recession really hitting us. So that's one of the major debate in our, for example, all my Congress people that I've been talking to in New York about how this really recession is impacting. So the mobilization is very clear. Our role and our goal should be to continue to contact our congressional people. And for those folks who are here, who are elected, they do have access to these Congress people. They should be reaching out to them as well, as we all will continue to do so, because we want to see the 12 to be 100. And if we can get the 100 to be 200, we will continue to flourish and galvanize on that. And I hope that when we come back, when Congress come back from recess, that we might be able to have some of the Congress people that are co-sponsoring the resolution to be in our conversation as well, to see how we can help them. And I will say this, I will be in Washington in August 12th through the 16th in another matter, but I will take advantage of that because I will be meeting with Nancy Pelosi, I will be meeting with Chuck Schumer, I will be meeting with the minority leaders in both houses on some of the issues that I'm working with, was mentioned before about EV, electrical vehicle, climate change. So I will be doing that week over there. And as a result that I know some of the members and some of the leadership folks, and I keep in touch with them. So I'm going to make sure that I have a little 3 pages with me about the national infrastructure banking to give it to this to Chuck Schumer and others in person. So let's keep the faith. Let's be very, very serious about it. I think we have come a long time. I don't mean that we're not serious. I think that we've been too serious because we're spending a lot of time on doing what we're doing every night and every other night or every other week. And I know that Stuart and others meet almost every week, every day. And I hope that we'll be able to it's not that I want to convince, I want the Congress people and the US Senate to convince themselves that this is something that is for the benefit and better yet of the future of their children and grandchildren as well as mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. We are so glad to have you on our team and appreciate your efforts and all you do for the National Infrastructure Bank movement. Next, I'd like to go to another one of our leaders in Washington State. I'd like to introduce everyone to Senator Bob Hasegawa from Washington State. He has led in getting our resolution introduced in the Washington legislature, and he is the author of the resolution that will be read in the Council of State Government meeting, or conference rather, that's coming up here in a few weeks this summer. So Senator Hasegawa, you've got the floor.
Thank you so much. Appreciation to all of you who are on this call and willing to support and do the work necessary to get the bill passed, HR 3339 by Representative Davis. And I bring you greetings from the heartland of Washington, actually. I'm in Yakima, Washington, which is, as you may or may not know around the country, is kind of the heart of agriculture country here in Washington state. And the reason I raise that issue is that this is really a nonpartisan issue. Everybody should be about improving our basic infrastructure. And when you think about the economy, what's the basic infrastructure for an economy? It's money. And if the people don't control the money, but rather private interests control the money supply, then we've pretty much relegated ourselves to perpetual indebtedness. So here we are on the eve of Independence Day. Happy 4th of July to you all. And I think it's a perfect time to draw the comparison between independence for our country and independence for the money supply, which the National Infrastructure Bank proposal is all about. So if I can share just a quick story, my family, my entire community, all Americans of Japanese descent were incarcerated during World War II. Many of my family members, even when they were in American concentration camps behind barbed wire with guns pointing in at them from the guardhouses, volunteered to fight in World War II. And they formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which if you do or do not know, you should really Google it because it's an amazing story about Americanism and American history. But the reason that they volunteered even while they were in concentration camps was they believed in the Constitution and everything that it stood for. And they wanted to prove their loyalty not to the political administrations, but to the Constitution. And the Constitution didn't relegate us to perpetual indebtedness and wage slavery. It provided the means for us to make for a more perfect union. It gave us the right to have a voice in how we think our country should move forward. And that didn't mean by leaving working people behind and exploiting them for their labor so that a few at the very top could get more wealthy. So they went on to become the most decorated unit in the history of the US Army. These are fighting men who volunteered while incarcerated in American concentration camps. My goal is to make sure that their dream for a more perfect union is achieved, but we cannot do that as long as we're in perpetual indebtedness. So my ask of you all right now in this weekend of the 4th of July is to think about how are we going to build our economic independence and get back to that can-do spirit that is the American spirit. So the American banking system, as originally envisioned by Alexander Hamilton, as previous speakers had spoken of, is the American system. We've diverged from that so far that it's all about privatization and profiteering and greed. If your state that you live in, wherever you are, is probably very similar to mine in the sense that in order to build infrastructure, we rely heavily on our bonding capacity and how much in bonds we can sell. And that constrains us to how much infrastructure we can develop. Well, the American Society of Civil Engineers says that ain't cutting it. We're at a C- as a country. And in fact, Washington State here is at a C- as well, because you can only borrow so much money. And even though your needs far surpass what our capacity is to borrow, we would, even if we could borrow that money, half of that money is going as profit to the people we borrow from. So you can see as we borrow more and more over the years, we're increasing our debt to such an extent that we just can't borrow anymore. We have to find a better way. That's what the National Infrastructure Bank is all about, providing us the vast lending capacity, not through selling bonds, but through regular short-term loans, through using the power of money as a basic infrastructure and the power of banking to be able to finance the infrastructure we need so that we can remain globally competitive. Assemblymember Ruiz, sorry, spacing on the name right now. At any rate, he talked about China, and that I've been there too. And I have to tell you, in 10 years, they built 15,000 miles of high-speed rail. That's well beyond just the subways that connect all of their cities and the housing that they're providing or creating throughout their country. We don't have that capacity. And until we figure out how as a country we can re-adopt that can-do spirit and say, this is what it takes to get it done, and this is the financing capacity we need to get it done. Unless we can do that, we're going to lose our global standing. So I see it as inevitable that something like this has to happen. So when you think about past Independence Days, past presidents, we think about President Roosevelt and how his programs helped develop Washington State's agriculture business through the Columbia Basin Project and Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Power and all of these different programs that were, a lot of it was meant to build infrastructure. A lot of the purpose was job development. And with the National Infrastructure Bank creating 25 million jobs off of the 5 trillion in lending capacity, in this time of impending recession, we need to have those good access to good family wage jobs. Public banks are counter-cyclical in the sense that when commercial banks tighten credit during recessionary cycles because they're not so sure that their borrowers can repay the loans, public banks have a public mission, not a profit mission. So that's when public banks can inject money into our system and keep our economy going. That's how you get through the recession. So my ask for you is this, that you do something similar to what I am pledging to you to do this weekend. I will be sending a letter to all of the congressional representatives, Democrats and Republicans, to say this is a nonpartisan issue. We all want what's best for America. And on Independence Day, we hope that you will consider co-sponsoring House Resolution 3339, creating the National Infrastructure Bank. And the CSG West has already been mentioned, so I won't get into that. Council of State Governments West is a national organization of state legislators. So I'll be doing a work session there, and hopefully we'll be passing a resolution to support it there. Senator Tallman from New Mexico will be sponsoring a similar resolution at the National Conference of State Legislatures annual meeting coming up in August. So I hope that you help spread the word, educate your colleagues, talk to your community-based organizations that you participate in, and let's get this done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Hasegawa. You are a very inspiring speaker, so we really appreciate you being here this evening. We're going to move right along. We've got a few more speakers we want to get through so we can open it up for questions and answers. So now I'd like to go out to the East Coast, New Jersey, where we have Assemblyman John Guardian on the line. John? There he is. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you? I'm thrilled to be joining this program this evening. You know, we are very grateful for the funding on a state level that passed last November, but we all know that it's not enough funding. And I come from the state of New Jersey, where we have a state infrastructure bank, again, a great help, but doesn't have sufficient funding for the needs that we have. We're an older state. Some things we can handle ourselves, but our future is really going to be in the hands of infrastructure bank that we so desperately need. We're doing some exciting things here. We have 100 windmills, wind energy that is going to be placed 15 miles off of the coast of New Jersey, 100 of them, 60 stories high, producing energy. But the point is that it's going to come into a system that's not currently available to handle that capacity of clean, green energy. And an infrastructure bank is just what we need to make sure that that is connected with the rest of the state, our states that are close to us, and indeed the whole Northeast. Recently, we tested our schools for lead in their water fountains and found that 85% of all schools did indeed have lead. That's easy to fix with a filtration system, but it raises the much greater question, and that is how much lead are in the water lines that we have coming into our homes, our offices? How about the actual water lines we have in our streets? We know as we do reconstruction, some of these water lines are still wood and have been around for more than 100 years. And so the concept of infrastructure becomes critical to us here in New Jersey. We're an older state. We need to be developing new ways to figure out how to fix our roads, how to take care of replacing our bridges, how to build new interstates, how to work on an infrastructure program that's going to identify better ways of transportation. We all want to move to cleaner, greener energy. We all want to move to electric vehicles, but that's going to require electric charging stations. And so all of these ideas and more, from cleaning our water to building our infrastructure, to developing the infrastructure that's needed for affordable housing, especially in our urban areas, all need an infrastructure bank. That's why we're very excited. I'm very excited to be on the call today. But more importantly, I can tell you that the Infrastructure Assembly of the state of New Jersey unanimously passed. I co-signed the bill to ask the federal government to form this infrastructure bank, because $5 trillion is really just the start in the first 5 years. But this is the logical way for the United States to move forward and meet the needs that we're going to have. I'm glad that the two Republicans from New Jersey in Congress actually voted for the infrastructure bank that was brought to us back in November. But now we all need to work together to get our congressmen and our senators to vote for this infrastructure bank. We've rebuilt our country 4 times in the past. It's time to rebuild our country now for the future. And the infrastructure bank is the logical way of funding these programs. Thank you so much, and I wish everyone a wonderful, happy 4th of July.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Appreciate your remarks. Quickly, we are now going to go to Mary Jane Shimsky. I believe she is on the line, and Mary Jane comes to us from Westchester County, New York. And Mary Jane?
Yes, I'm here, Julie. Thank you so much. I just got on the call a few minutes ago, so I don't want to replow the same land, but certainly Assemblyman Guardian's points are very well taken. Those of us who live in the Northeast or the Midwest know very well what it's like to have to contend with aging infrastructure. The National Infrastructure Bank, of course, is a solution that has been used in multiple times of our country's history. And all of those times it ushered in eras of economic development, technological development, and prosperity. We can certainly use that now, especially given how much advancement is going on in other parts of the world. The way we're going to be able to compete and continue to be a leading economic power is if we invest in all of our infrastructure, from the basics like clean water all the way to the new technologies involving alternative energy and high-speed rail and other forms of transportation. So at the Westchester County Board of Legislators, it was a no-brainer for us to pass a resolution in support of HR 3339. The New York State Association of Counties, or NISAC, also passed a resolution. And I understand that more and more members of Congress are signing on to the bill. This is something that we are going to have to persist with and keep persisting until it's done, because when it's done, it will create massive benefits for all of us. So thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you, Mary Jane, appreciate it. Next, we are going to go to the middle of the country. We don't want people thinking that this is just a bi-coastal group. And I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Alan Green, who is currently a candidate for Missouri State Auditor. Dr. Green?
First of all, I want to say thank you. It's always an honor to speak on behalf of the coalition and with the coalition on the infrastructure bank. I've had a opportunity now to speak from the state of Washington to South Carolina and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan and Illinois, and so I've had a chance now to give my input on this. But I've also had a chance to speak at conferences on this, on infrastructure, the current infrastructure bill we have now, and talking about the infrastructure bank. So then I have a engagement coming up in Las Vegas in July on this infrastructure. So what's so important about all of this is, as I was listening to, is that when we're talking about the housing projects that can and could get done, fiber optics, high-speed rail, of course, roads and bridges, we have to talk about, but we talk about jobs, and bringing jobs back to our country, which is so, so important. But a key component of that is making sure that we have, training and input and making sure that the next generation is prepared as we build. But as we know too, the current infrastructure bill only covers 10%. So we need this infrastructure bank to cover the other 90%. And so I'm very honored on this particular day to talk about that. As I travel the state of Missouri, running for state auditor for the state of Missouri, I hear in the rural areas so many times when we're talking about, again, they don't have access to the internet, and they don't have fiber optics. They don't have a lot of those things that a lot of the suburban and urban areas take for granted. They just don't have those things. And so when we're talking about, even in those rural areas, roads and bridges, they need to be repaired. And so over and over and over again, from Arkansas border tip to Iowa, the border tip, I'm hearing this. And so I just want to say, for those that are out there, this is a very, very, very important initiative, and I am in support of it and many others. Again, so let's support 3339, the congressional bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, appreciate that. Certainly building and construction is a very important part, critical to what the National Infrastructure Bank proposes. And so I would like to bring on James Lou Spencer, who is the Vice President of the Virginia State Building and Construction Trades, to perhaps make some comments about how the NIB would impact the construction and building industry.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, hello and good evening. My name is Lou Spencer. I'm the Assistant Business Manager of United Association Local Union Number 5, Plumbers and Gas Fitters. And I'm also the Vice President of the Virginia Building and Construction Trades Council. I support the National Infrastructure Bank. First, happy Independence Day weekend. As we reflect on the legacy of founder founding father, Alexander Hamilton, and the American system, and consider today's ongoing economic predicament, we must remember that we have faced these challenges before and have had to face large unpayable debts and a less than productive economy. The United States has been down before. We always accept a good challenge, and we will rise to take on the current task. This will take bold leadership, it will take congressional action, and it will take an institution capable of transforming our great nation to even greater heights. Today, we focus on the creation of a new national infrastructure bank, as expressed in HR 3339. We can and must build our way out of this predicament. This is a bold plan. We need to build infrastructure and encourage industry the American way. What a wonderful day to honor Independence Day. The new National Infrastructure Bank will support trillions dedicated to infrastructure projects. This excellent program will cost the federal budget extraordinarily little, next to nothing, while creating millions of high-paying jobs and bring real solutions to transportation, manufacturing, while improving our standard of living. We know the infrastructure development needs require careful planning and a reliable source of long-term funding in order for it to succeed. It is most unlikely the adequate infrastructure financing to cover all the nation's infrastructure needs will ever come from the federal budget. HR 3339 is introduced in Congress to create a national infrastructure bank, and the infrastructure bank is configured to attract maximum political support from both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Infrastructure projects will be vetted according to their cost and by cost-benefit analysis, and a set of specific criteria set out in the bill. Our nation requires improved highways, roads, bridges, mass transit, water and sewer lines, airports, seaports, rail, electric power, telecommunication systems, and airports. Addressing the nation's infrastructure needs and more, the National Infrastructure Bank will uplift millions into respectable careers, build up and link up our urban and rural areas, support commerce and manufacturing, and restore a sense of dignity and confidence to our great nation. We are at the precise moment in history. This opportunity is here now. We must act, and future generations will thank us. Have a great evening. Have a wonderful Independence Day weekend. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Lou. We appreciate it. And now, I do believe for our final speaker of the evening, I am going to introduce you to a superstar. And this guy, I'm holding him personally responsible for getting two, I believe two, maybe three of the Congress people from his state signed up as supporters, co-sponsors of our bill. So with that, I would like to introduce Senator Bill Tallman from New Mexico.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the kind words.
Well, I
of
can
induction, and I've been told I only have 2 or 3 minutes, which is good because my mother used to tell me that you should speak long enough that they remembered that you spoke, but not so long that they figured out you were a poor speaker. So with that, why did I got interested in this very important issue for 2 reasons. One, I've been to China and Europe, and you come back from China and Europe and you feel like you're in a third world country. China spends 3 times more than we do on infrastructure. Europe spends twice as much as we do. Also, the second reason is the infrastructure bill that Biden signed in November of last year is totally inadequate. Just here in New Mexico, we need $2 billion to provide broadband to every household in the state. We're only getting 100 million, 1/20th of what we need. Electric grid, we're getting nothing. We have the second sunniest state in the country. We're one of the top 5 windiest, so we have the potential to produce a lot of renewable energy. And the experts are telling us that we're rapidly getting to the point where we won't be able to transmit any more power. Getting zero money from the electric grid. Water infrastructure, we're in a severe drought here in the Southwest. We've had some of the worst forest fires in the country, and more are expected. And we're We had the state engineer quit recently and publicly stated that he's quitting because he didn't have the resources. He needs $2 billion to do all the things to increase our water infrastructure. And we're getting 350 million, 1/6 of what we need. High-speed rail, we're getting nothing. I've seen maps that show that the first high-speed rail to be built would be between Mississippi River and California, would go through New Mexico. We're getting nothing. And roads and bridges, 74 cents of every dollar that we're getting from the 1.1 trillion is going for roads and bridges. You can make a good argument. That's not our top priority, but experts who know Washington tell me that that's because the highway contractors and the automobile manufacturers have a strong influence. So I've taken a great interest in this, and I've introduced resolutions in the state Senate, and I authored a op-ed in the state's largest newspaper pushing this idea. And then several months after that, we got 20 signatures on a op-ed promoting HB 3339. And I've never seen that many signatures on an op-ed piece in New Mexico. So we, and I've discussed this issue at both a regional and a national conference of the Council of State Governments. And I've been on at least 24 of these nationwide Zoom meetings. And that's all been led to a climax of working to to get 2 of our 3 Congress women to all 3 of our Congress people are women. 2 of them have signed on to this bill, which was not an easy task. Just getting the staff and the Congress people on the telephone is a great undertaking. I wouldn't suggest anybody try to do this just for fun. So we're very pleased about that. And it has already been mentioned, have been successful in getting the SC, the National Council of State Legislatures, the National Conference of State Legislatures, to put a resolution on their agenda at their early August meeting, promoting and urging Congress to enact HB 3339. So there was 2 hurdles. It's kind of a bureaucratic organization. It took 2 hurdles just to get the resolution on their agenda. You just don't send a resolution in and they put it on the agenda. So, this is a good example. This is an excellent example, but just because it's a good example, it's a good idea, that it doesn't mean it's going to get implemented. There's a lot of good ideas out there that don't get implemented, but this is really something that really needs to be done, as I've already pointed out. But there's so many issues in the United States that we're not moving on fast enough. Mental health, immigration, crime, climate change, guns, housing crisis, income inequality, and the hollowing out of the middle class. We're not making any progress. Even on guns, they said it was bipartisan. This is a Democratic state, but the largest newspaper is Republican, and they had an editorial today saying the headline was, "The gun law is not going to solve the problem because it really doesn't do enough. There's still going to be too many guns on the street." So they're calling it a bipartisan thing, but it's not really doing anything. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do. We're really on a cliff here in the United States. If we could go either way, and this is, if we don't get this bill enacted, this is just one more nail in our coffin. So this is very extremely important for so many reasons, and so many obvious reasons. It should be bipartisan, but unfortunately, in today's political climate, just because it's a good idea and the other side is supporting it, doesn't mean it's going to get enacted, unfortunately. But so I don't mean to sound the opposite of optimistic. I'm basically an optimistic person, or I wouldn't be working on this issue. So that's all I got. Thanks for listening. And please, everybody, do everything you can to help promote the enactment of HB 3339 because it's so important. Thank you very much.
I do want to say that the coalition is working every day to reach out to people, legislators across the political spectrum, whether they're Republicans or independents or Democrats, to really build that support around the country. And and I think that we all need to keep doing our part, and little by little, we are seeing the momentum behind the National Infrastructure Bank bill continue to build. Yeah, with that, I would like to open it up for questions and answers. If you can raise your hands, and I see a question already from Evelyn Vinogradov. Did I pronounce that right? Evelyn, you're muted.
Yes, you pronounced it right. I want to thank Bill Tallman from New Mexico for being here. And one of these days, I'm actually going to sit down and have a cup of coffee with him, because from the grassroots level and from the Democratic Party level, I think we can make a lot of good changes here. I'm the Democratic Party Rural Caucus Chair for the state of New Mexico, and I wanted to thank Bill. That was the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is I wanted to share with you some really positive news that just came out a few days ago. Our New Mexico Land Commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, created the first ever Office of Renewable Energy within the State Land Office to help grow New Mexico's renewable energy portfolio, right? So this happened when she took office a few years later, whatever. But the creation of this new office has now led to the construction of La Jolla Wind Farm's 207 megawatts on 35,000 acres of state trust land in Torrance County, which I live near. I'm in Santa Fe County. So the Western Spirit Wind Farm, Borderlands Wind Farm, and the approval of 4 leases for the city of Las Cruces to power water wells with solar energy and much more. Now, there recently was an addition of 11 new wind leases, which brings the total number of wind energy leases on state trust land to 26. There's a project that is touted to be the biggest in the Western Hemisphere as far as wind energy is concerned.
Senator Tallman, did you want to respond to Evelyn?
Yes, well, obviously we have the potential to produce substantially more power than we need. So a lot of it is being transmitted to California and other surrounding states. But yeah, the local governments benefit because the property taxes on the infrastructure, the windmills and the solar panels. So I know some of these rural counties are realizing substantial increases in property tax, and also the landowners receive a very substantial amount of money from the energy companies for the use of their land. So I don't think it's been a concern that people are getting rich, although I can't. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that yes, we won't be able to use all of our power, which is a good thing. And at the same time, I know for a fact that landowners are benefiting. In fact, some of the ranchers are not only realizing an income from their agricultural, their products and their beef cattle, but also they're getting a income from the power companies for the use of their land, and the county governments I know have a substantial increase in their property taxes due to the increased value of the land. And so yeah, that's
That's it. You're exactly right. That landowners can be 50% of New Mexico's land surface is covered by cattle farms and agricultural production, and they can lease out their land for wind farms and solar too. The secret is going to be able to transport it, and the National Infrastructure Bank has $80 billion in it for a renewable energy grid overlay that can export energy from those areas, those local areas, east and west, to countering neighboring states. Professor Hockett, did you want to add something too?
Yeah, just a couple of really quick things. I'll speak specifically to the matter of keeping a bank of this sort from sort of being captured by sectional private sector interests. So Elfeka is much more distinguished than I am, but we're both veterans of the IMF in the late 90s, in my case, in early 2000s. And Elfeka has a somewhat longer history with the institution. But one thing she'll recognize immediately, I suspect, is that there are at least a couple of models for infrastructure banks or development banks that have been kind of hip or trendy at various points over the last 20 or 30 years. And one of them, you can kind of reduce it to a case where you've got public capital being deployed and managed by private managers. In the other model, you have private capital joining public capital, and it remains under the supervision of public sector actors. It's the latter that we want. Emphatically, it's the latter that we want. It's the former that was sometimes bandied about, again, in a kind of hipsterish sort of way by Clinton types, I think in the 1990s. And that's the thing to avoid. You want to make sure that the public sector stays in the driver's seat. And one quick object lesson, just going back to an example that I raised before, I think is very helpful here. I noted that the War Planning Board that Roosevelt put into place to sort of oversee and coordinate the World War II mobilization mixed public sector and private sector actors together. But there was never any question as to who was in the driver's seat and who was in charge. And indeed, American labor probably never had it so good as it had during that mobilization. I can show you photographs of private sector presidents of corporations being carried out of factories by US military personnel in uniform when they refused to comply with national labor laws and anti-discrimination laws and the like in the 1940s. And the thought was, we don't have time for this nonsense right now. We've got a war to fight against racists, by the way. And so one thing we're not going to put up with in our industries is that kind of thing. And of course, we saw an advancement of African Americans into managerial roles that they had previously been debarred from by racists. We saw a massive entry into the workforce by American women during this time, as sort of iconically portrayed by Rosie the Riveter, but it was actually much more sophisticated and much more broad-based than that. And that's the kind of thing that you can do when you mix public and private on the one hand, while keeping the public sector firmly in the driver's seat on the other hand. And that's a real key difference, I think, between Elfeka's proposal, Ellen's, and my proposals, the rest of our proposals on the one hand, and some of those sort of PPPs or 3Ps, i.e. public-private partnerships that we heard about in the 1990s. Altogether different animal.
Great, thank you very much. So I would agree that the statute of the National Infrastructure Bank, HR 3339, sets out these exact criteria for giving the loans. It puts the board in charge of selecting the loans, and the private investors in the bank are silent partners. They provide the capitalization, and we want to make sure that the bank keeps on track to lend into the real sector and will assess projects on their merit to produce economic growth and build the required infrastructure. Carl Peterson, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I was just wondering, the four banks that historically started off the Hamiltonian method here, why were they sunsetted, number one? And number two, will this new bank have to endure the same forces that caused that sunset? Thanks very much.
Well, maybe I could take that question. They had a 20-year sunset clause in them. That was the tradition, I presume, unless Ellen can correct me if I'm wrong, that started out with Alexander Hamilton's bank. That turned out not to be a good choice, because when the 20 years were up and they didn't renew the institution, then they fell into hard economic times, and then they came back and needed to restart it again. So the lesson we've learned from those 4 years, those 4 bank experiences were in the bill now, there is no sunset clause. Whether that gets changed in the markups on the bill, we'll see. But for the moment, we are going to try and keep this as a permanent institution. And we also don't want to make the same mistakes of the Export-Import Bank, which can't seem to lend for promoting American manufacturing, because every 5 years it needs to be renewed and becomes a political football in Congress. So the best role here would be to have a permanent bank. We need a permanent bank, a permanent institution, and a permanent monitoring ministry or mechanism, if you will, planning organization, because infrastructure is a long-term and complicated job.
If I could just throw in one quick thing here, I think Ellen's point earlier in discussing the history is very important to remember here as well. As she noted, a lot of people originally thought that the Hamiltonian plan was essentially a retread for the US of the Bank of England model. And that was a scurrious slander, right? It was the very contrary of that, as Ellen pointed out. And I think the challenge that we have today, there's a kind of a counterpart challenge, and that's the one I sort of alluded to a moment ago in a way. Elfeka and I are very aware of the sort of false PPP model of the 1990s, but a lot of other people are not. And some people then are likely to sort of slander our current proposals by saying, oh, isn't this what Clinton tried in the 1990s? Isn't it just PPP? Isn't that basically just corruption? Isn't that just capture of a public institution by private sector shills? And the answer is no, if we do it right. So I think we have to take care to distinguish what we're pushing from what was sort of played with in the 90s, in the same way that Hamilton had to distinguish his Bank of the US from the Bank of England, which the Madisonians and Jeffersonians tried to kind of tar it with the image of.
Right, those are really great points. Okay, how about Darcy Monforte? Did you have a question?
I do. And it's along the same lines. I'm going to attempt to convince my Republican state senator to sign on. And my fear is that he's going to be like, oh, well, we should put private sector in the driver's chair. So does anybody have any advice for me to help?
Yes, so we've actually done a paper on the pitfalls of private-public partnerships, not even looking at the Clinton model, but just looking at things like TIFIA loans and public-private partnerships to build toll roads. Virginia is a great example of that. They don't lead to good planning. They are high cost. They require high internal rates of return, as much as 7 to 10% internal rate of return, so high that you have to cross-subsidize their interest rates that they charge. And they don't plan well either. That's not the best public planning that you can do for infrastructure. And they'll only build on high toll roads where they can get a maximum rate of return. They're not going to build local bridges and rural roads and things like that. So those are all places where we've had the experience that it's not working. Plus the fact that a new iteration of a national infrastructure bank in Canada also does not seem to be working very well. It's using a private partnership model, and it's been accused of giving out high rates of return to private sector parties, and is not a good iteration, a follow-on iteration of the former Canadian infrastructure bank. So we want to make sure that we can keep public infrastructure in public hands. That's the main objective of the infrastructure bank.
I could maybe throw in one quick thing for Darcy in particular. I mean, one thing you might do, Darcy, at least I find this to be tactically helpful. If somebody's sort of a champion of the private sector or a private sector firm or industry for a particular public project, I'll always, or at least I'll frequently point out that it's actually individually rational for private sector actors who are involved in these things to try to get the most they can for their shareholders, which is not the most that we can get for the public. So one way to describe this is you say, look, private sector firms are good at doing what they're meant to do, which is to make money just for their owners, who constitute a tiny minority of the population. And we don't even have to demonize them. We can just say, well, you know, they view their fiduciary duties as being owed to their shareholders rather than to the public as a whole. But any public project, anything that we, you know, dignify with the name public infrastructure or public this or public that, has to inure to the benefit of everybody. And that means it cannot be primarily profit motivated. It can be at least break even motivated if we're trying to save money or what have you, but it should never be privately sort of profit oriented or profit motivated. And it especially shouldn't be profit maximization motivated or oriented, because again, that's just for small numbers of people who happen to own businesses, and we're not those people.
Awesome. Thank you both very much.
Great. Julie's still not back on yet? No, it doesn't seem so. So Randy Grind, did you have a question?
Not a question, just a follow on to this. There are quite a few other examples of exactly what you're talking about. One is in Washington State, we had quite a bit of trouble getting adequate services to rural areas, simply because it wasn't profitable to run phone lines out there. One of the best things that we'd done in the past 20 some years was to allow public utility districts to provide bandwidth to areas and then resell that dark fiber to allow for connections. Another example is the public utility districts themselves. Alfec, you may have more data on this than I do, but since 1930, when we started to allow public utility districts, we've gradually increased to where about half of the state has chosen to go with public power, and in general, it's more cost effective and provides better service. Because, well, let's face it, a private company doesn't operate well as a monopoly, and that's fundamentally what these infrastructure services are.
I'd like to offer up another comment for DRC, and that is that a national infrastructure bank and infrastructure projects will provide huge opportunities for the private sector, because the bank is not going to be running the bulldozers and the cranes and designing building plans. All of those contracts are going to go out to the private sector. And so there will be so much opportunity for the private sector that it would be a natural for business people to get on board, because it's going to give them huge amounts of opportunity to bid on projects and work on projects and expand their businesses. So I'd just like to point that out. And then I actually have a comment for Professor Hockett. And I guess I'm wondering about, if you want to attack the supply side of the issue, what is your view on funneling contracts, or making sure that the contracts go to smaller businesses so we can avoid the concentration of business in just a very few very large companies? How would you handle that?
Yeah, I think there are a number of ways to handle that, Julie, but I think in general, there ought to be, there's several interests that we can kind of pursue as sort of collateral to the interest of public investment, right? That is to say, we can view there as, we can see there as being, we can see that there are multiple possible implications from big public investment projects. And so we can seek to optimize those particular implications as well. So one interest that we want to optimize is, of course, the interest in healthy competition within industries, right? And avoidance of too much concentration within any given industry. And that, of course, then militates in favor of basically awarding contracts to lots of different providers whenever possible, rather than just favoring some individual provider or some big sort of monopolistic or oligopolistic set of providers. Another thing to look at, and we can do more or less of this, is to look at historically disfavored or less favored businesses or people, right? Minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses maybe deserve something of a preferential option, or at least a tiebreaker option in some cases where that's a feasible thing to do. Another possibility that came up in our last conversation a couple of weeks ago is some firms are employee owned rather than capital owned, and some firms are kind of mixed employee and capital owned. And that's a model that we might want to be encouraging going forward into the future in order to ensure that as industries grow increasingly automated, we don't end up having a big mass unemployment problem. And so we can try to award contracts in ways that are somewhat encouraging of those kinds of businesses too. There's always a risk of sort of losing sight of the primary focus of the mission if we focus entirely or exclusively on that on those other interests. But it seems also at the same time that we can hardly ignore them, particularly if we're talking about big public decisions that have those kinds of implications or impacts along multiple policy dimensions.
Thank you for those remarks. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I don't see any hands raised right at the moment. No? Okay, well, I think what we'd like to do is share some more additional information with everybody on the line. And so we had talked previously about this. We do have upcoming resolutions that are being presented at these two conferences, the Council of State Governments in Boise, Idaho, and Senator Hasegawa will be there leading the charge with that at that conference. And then we have Senator Tallman, who is doing much of the work at the National Conference of State Legislators. So we're really thrilled to be there. Both of these are very influential groups. As I understand it, there's around 600 some odd people that attend the National Conference of State Legislators. So a pretty influential group. The next thing we want to share with you here are some tools that we have developed, and this is for everybody here. These flyers, downloadable flyers, are on our website. And the idea here is that you would be able to download these and share them with your local assembly people and legislators and that sort of thing. I'm sure you all probably heard this, but in marketing, we say that you need to get your idea, your name, your idea in front of somebody 7 times, 8 times before it really sinks in. And so having a brochure that you would be able to share with people, whether it's your neighbor, the folks at work, your local legislators, this is really going to help you be able to present that information to those folks and help build awareness of the National Infrastructure Bank. So these are available for download on our website. Next, I would like y'all to know that we are working on another fundraising campaign. We intend on putting some advertisements in for the 2 upcoming conferences, and of course that costs money. We have our brochure printing costs, and then just our standard organizational costs for video and putting on presentations like this. So we'd really love to urge folks to go to our website and hit the donate button. Of course, we also take checks, and so you can get our address from our website. And if you know anybody in the private sector that might really benefit from the additional projects that they would be able to bid on and help participate in, we would love to get their contributions. We're just a grassroots organization, and any donations will help us further the cause. And so you saw our website address there. And finally, we'd like to ask everyone to call your member of Congress and ask them to co-sponsor HR 3339. And we definitely are looking for Republican co-sponsors. That's part of our, sort of our daily strategizing, is looking for those Republicans that we can talk to and try to get signed up as a co-sponsor. So here you see all our contact information. We are happy to help you in your area of the country. And so if you want help writing an op-ed, you'd like us to set up a meeting with your assembly person or legislator, we are happy to do that and set up a personal meeting for the folks in your area. And let's see, I think that's pretty much it, but don't sign off because we have one more item to share with you. Alexander Hamilton has a word for y'all.
Every other founding father story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old.
And when you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame? Who tells your story? Who tells your story? Who tells your story?
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Happy Independence Day.